Thank you, John, for indicating that this could be a project that could have significance. We like to believe so, and when we embarked on this, we were a little defensive about it. But people like Dr. Klinzing and the University Research Council thought that maybe there's some merit in this idea, and they supported us. And it's gathering a lot of steam, George, you may be delighted to hear, and a lot of partners around the world. And many of you who are here have been partners with us in this journey, and so delighted to see you here again. I hope you'll make a few more partners here who join the network that BoH talked about. So I'd like to recap what we are doing and what, to some extent, we have been able to do in taking this germ of an idea, as Dr. Delaney mentioned it, and continue. Now, BoH just talked about the goals of the project, and I'd like to go back a step further and talk about the motivation of the project. And you might recognize that in recent years, the importance of a variety of stakeholders has been increasingly recognized. If you go past the Milton Friedman focus on the shareholder as the primary, if not the sole, critical owner of, quote, residual income of organizations, it creates a challenging world for organizations, but as many of you would say, challenges that offer enormous opportunities. And we started noticing something in the popular press also. Even the New York Times talked about the profitability of good works. Organizations that are engaged in doing good work that are generating economic value. And something that we have known for my mentor, Dr. Dearden, John Dearden, in the 60s, wrote about the incredible shortfalls and shortcomings of accounting profits if it's used to guide strategic decisions in organizations. There's a variety of very powerful reasons, the most fundamental one of which is the fact that accounting profits and economic profits are two different things. And the openness of accounting profits to manipulation, just to say that's one of the motivations here. If that's not the helpful criterion that it's purported to be, then what alternatives are there? And underlying all of this is something that BoH and I totally recognize, that business is a critically important component of society. And there is a role for business in terms of moving society and humanity forward. And continuing this notion, something that we began to see, and I'll point to some of the publications that have identified this, what is seen as corporate social responsibility. Once you make profits, what is your responsibility in terms of sharing those profits with the community, with possibly the employees, with other good work, so to speak? That was the fundamental thought. But as John Delaney mentioned, we are taking this and making it a set of considerations that precede the making of profit, that actually guide the making of profit, that stimulate the making of profit, that enhance the making of profit. And we'll come to why this is important in a second. But essentially what you're saying is you pay attention to quality, you pay attention to safety, you pay attention to gender equality, you pay attention to diversity, you pay attention to environmental sustainability, social sustainability, your profits enhance. I mean, when we started this project, that was sort of a Pollyannish hope that we had. But it is becoming pretty clear that this is more than a hope, it's a reality, and there's a recognition of the reality that's emerging of late. So that's something we'd like to talk about. The notion of humankind is another parallel dimension, and the shifting center of economic power, the shifting center of gravity of economic power is a phenomenon which the magnitude of which is difficult to grasp. If you're talking about growth, if you're talking in economic terms, where it's happening is in a very different part of the world than it traditionally has. We are talking about innovation happening in different parts of the world. We're talking about economic power going to different parts of the world. And if you look up Webster, humaneness and humankind are the two dimensions which constitute the notion of humanity. So we use that sort of broad construct. And there is a thought here, as will become apparent, many of the threads that we are using are being recognized and responded to very effectively. For example, sustainability has become a mantra, green is gold. What I think is different about this is two things. One, we are shifting it to what are the criteria we use in order to enhance profit, and secondly, we have put a whole lot of strands together. If you look at the variety of considerations that you're bringing to bear, I don't think most other efforts of this nature, and I've seen a few, like the business of sustainability and so on, actually capture the variety of dimensions that we will be sharing as we go along. Again, in terms of the origins of the proposition, when you look at the transformation of some very significant organizations, we have seen transformations in a negative sense in Pittsburgh. There are companies here that don't exist anymore, like Westinghouse in its old form. Westinghouse as a nuclear-oriented, the nuclear-oriented division of Westinghouse still exists, but it's a Japanese company owned by Toshiba. But if you look at the negatives like Enron and Westinghouse, if you look at the positives such as Rockwell and GE, it's very clear that the notion of humanity was absent in one sense, where the primacy was given to shareholder value and nothing else. And if you look at the positives like Rockwell and GE, and the reason you have in your little bag a book by Don Beal, who, by the way, is an alumnus of our school, and who wrote about the transformation of Rockwell, creating this extraordinary enterprise, and the humane and humanity-oriented considerations that drove this transformation are captured in his book. But if you look at GE in the late 40s and early 50s, had captured the notions of public responsibility, had captured the notion of employee morale, had captured the notion of residual income, which has now caught on and so on, but there's a breadth of understanding in a variety of key result areas that they identified which has driven their extraordinary success. No other diversified company has existed so long so successfully. And I think partly it's because of their implicit recognition of humanity. This is the Don Beal book, where I think each of you have a copy of this. Don was very generous and provided us with this. But he talked about companies are really a reflection of the people. They have an identity, they have a reality, and the culture and values of the people are reflected in the organization. We saw what some of the best and brightest did to some unnamed companies, quote unquote, best and brightest. So if you look at Rockwell, if you look at Vodafone Czech Republic, you'll see the humanity emerging as a driver for success. There's a whole bunch of best practice companies we studied before the project started, so to speak. And this was part of a variety of other benchmarking efforts that were organized by about 87 companies and the American Productivity and Quality Center. Our research methodology, case studies, we have a whole host of them. We have a bunch of them on our website. More are coming on. Yesterday we put on Apollo Hospitals from India, which is an iconic organization that's transformed the health landscape in India. It'd be wonderful to hear that they also look at humanity as the driver in terms of what they're doing. In fact, President Obama said that there's much that the U.S. can learn from the experience of Apollo Hospitals in terms of the healthcare situation here. So we have a variety of interesting case studies. The first one is with Professor Jhunjhunwala from IIT Madras, who has made an enormous impact on the Indian scene, and we'll be hearing from him this afternoon. But this conference, as BoH has said, is critically important because we will be asking for your inputs, but beyond that, we hope there will be a community that we will develop that will remain in effect indefinitely and hopefully engage each other in terms of moving this idea forward and making it pragmatic. Something that's also distinguishing what you're doing from some of the other work is that we are hoping to help companies understand how best to take these ideas and implement them. So it's not just a concept. We're going to share how companies actually do it, what companies can do to take these somewhat amorphous ideas and translate that into 9 o'clock Monday morning, what do we do? These are the companies that are part of this study. We have actually videotape on all of them. Pittsburgh Filmmakers is working with us. But we have a whole bunch of documented anecdotal evidence, as BoH said, but there's a lot more coming, and there's some extraordinary companies in this group. And all of them are part of this project that we have been working on for the last year and a half. John mentioned a few of the elements of humaneness. It's a more comprehensive notion of what we are saying are humane criteria that actually affect profits positively. And I'm not going to go through these slides in detail. There is a good logic why these factors, when taken into account in making decisions, actually enhance profits. And there's a notion of taking into account what economists have ignored, what they're called externalities and set aside. So these have got to be included in the business model too. So we'll be talking about that as part of this exercise. Again, what we have here is a listing, and you have a copy of this, a listing of the reasons why each of these ideas actually can impact profits positively. What is of interest to me, and Dean Zoffer, Jerry Zoffer and I have been talking with Michael Jensen, the finance guru. And what was fascinating to me, and I think fascinating to Jerry too, was the notion that he uses integrity as the core principle around which he builds the management systems of financial service companies. I don't want to spend more time on that. It's so obvious that it's needed and necessary. But he says, the interesting thing he said to me was that he could also demonstrate that that enhances profits, which is a wonderful thing. I'd like to share with you Marcos Oliveira, president of Ford Brazil, which is a fantastic story. It's again a story we have on videotape on our website, where Ford set up this plant in northeastern rural Brazil. Some of you are from Brazil. The Bahia state is not that well developed. They went to an area where there's practically no industry, just one oil refinery. Started with a totally unprepared workforce, 10,000 employees, 5,000 Ford, 5,000 suppliers, and created at that time the finest assembly plant in the world from this extraordinarily difficult context. And they did it using ideas of humanity. And there's a notion here that Marcos Oliveira talks about, why doing the right thing actually helps them in terms of the bottom line. I'd like to share this with you.
We developed a wetlands type of environmental process that could take care of all the water that was being discharged by our operations through this wetland process, that we could either reutilize water in the manufacturing process, or it could use to take care of the environment in the region as well.
For an industry, you see, oh, we could put a treatment plant. No, we were going to give example, because if we can treat the sanitary waste for 5,000 employees, any city in the region could do the same, and the investment was very, very small.
But when you build that in your strategy from day one, it doesn't add cost.
They did the right thing, and it turned out actually to be a profitable decision. Let me play this one.
There are 10,000 families that have seen their purchasing power to grow. They can afford to buy a new house, to buy new cars, and obviously offer better education to their kids. The quality of the education has increased. The quality of life for the people in that region has increased, and the government sees that. They see the benefit, and they see it as a successful project.
And the fascinating thing is, when you see success in these broad terms of humanity, you get partners. And the state government and the federal government have been extraordinarily, how shall I say it, supportive partners, even building a new harbor for Ford, because this harbor at San Salvador was not good enough. It is really an extraordinary situation. The other dimension, let's move away from humaneness and talk a little bit about humankind. We talked about the shifting center of gravity earlier, and in the US we talk about the BRIC countries because of the Goldman Sachs study that showed that these countries are going to dominate by 2050. The latest estimate is by 2030, China is probably going to be #1 and the US is going to be #3. So in terms of economic power. So when you're looking at this kind of shifting center of gravity, and beyond that, I think, and this is something I'd like to take up in the discussion, demography is such a powerful, powerful factor. Willie Sutton identified this. He said, right, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Now, why do you need to go to the BRIC countries? Because that's where the people are. And you're talking about the dominant growth in the world happening there. In India, they talk more also about the basic countries, which includes South Africa, which I think is an interesting and necessary addition to our framework. Just a couple of slides here. This is the Kiran Karnik, very distinguished gentleman, another Padma Shri like Dr. Jhunjhunwala, recognized by the Indian government for his contribution, head of NASSCOM, and also the chairman of Satyam Computers. When it ran into trouble, when the chairman of Satyam Computers was found to have somehow made $1 billion evaporate, Kiran was sent in to turn the situation around. He did it in 6 months, and extraordinary person, but let's listen to him for a second.
Therefore, whatever you do, even if it is producing for the domestic market, you have to be prepared to compete with global products. And therefore, you have to have global quality, global prices, global delivery mechanisms. And once you do that, you say, hey, why don't I think globally in terms of market?
These are people that Dr. Blair and I interviewed in India. And the fascinating thing is, you may not realize this, but we, at the Strategic Management Society conference in December, Ravi, you were there, Pankaj Gemawat asked the group, where do you think the US is investing? And we said Mexico, and we said China. And he put the statistics up. These are trivial in relation to our affinity in the US for countries that we are comfortable with. Our investment is in Canada, our investment is growing in the UK. There are sort of blinders on, and I wanted to show you the very opposite thinking here. HCL actually made the first personal computer before Apple did. Okay. These are the guys who build the zero visibility landing systems for Airbus and Boeing. These are state-of-the-art people, and they don't see markets being, in a sense, bounded by geographic, by country characteristics and so on. It's really a global situation, and it's something I think the US needs to recognize.
Because you must remember, there are no US businesses, there are no Europe businesses, there are no Indian businesses, there are only global businesses. And if you have to succeed globally, then you'll have to partner globally, and I believe HCL will be out there in a very happy state.
Here we have Mr. Murugapan. He was talking about how in terms of strategy, they're broadening their thinking. For years, we have taught our students to focus even more precisely on an existing segment. We have sort of adopted the Groundhog Day view of the world. The world is going to be the same tomorrow, so if we learn how to improve what we did in the past, we are able to conquer it. I'd like to play Dr. Jhunjhunwala because he said something that was absolutely fascinating to me when I heard it.
And as we start working on connecting every village in India, we found that connectivity is only a first step in rural areas. The priority in rural areas is health, education, and livelihood.
When Dr. Jhunjhunwala, by the way, he just got an honorary doctorate from his alma mater in the US. When he went back to India from here, to increase the number of telephones in India, a very tangible kind of notion, very necessary in the country, and reflective of his competence and technical interests. And obviously, he was extraordinarily successful there, but as I saw it and listening to him, it was which for an engineer, for Dr. Kearns, maybe it's not so obvious an epiphany, but for an engineer to say, I'm not in the connectivity business, I'm in the human business. I care about health, education, and livelihood. We would say welfare here, health, education, and livelihood. The fascinating thing to me was that resulted in this incredible explosion of organizations, successful organizations. There's just a few of them, which started, in a sense, coming out of his efforts and his thinking, broadened by the notion of health, education, livelihood as the motivator, using our technological competence to address that, as opposed to saying, what are we able to do technologically, and try to, in a sense, push that forward. Change the whole perspective and the consequent success. So what we are talking about here is, when you talk about humankind, we are saying we've got to think about the world in general, and beyond that, this is the video I did not play, we have got to think about more than one segment, because that provides for disruptive additions to the technology, changes in our business, because we've got to do two things. Obviously, protect our core businesses right now, but we are dead if that's all we do, because the world is changing, and how does one, in a sense, motivate the developments and transformations we need? We have to look outside our zone of comfort. And a very attractive area to look at outside our zone of comfort is the areas where economic growth is exploding. And that includes, as we said, people at the bottom of the pyramid. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more, but this slide sort of reflects what you're saying, humaneness and humankind is humanity. And you look at the world through the lens of humanity, and you'll land up in some very interesting arenas that you otherwise may not have been sensitive to. And as we go along, it's become apparent this is something, if you look at what GE is doing these days, they're really going to the bottom of the pyramid, not only Prahalad's pyramid of income, but also a pyramid in terms of human needs. They're talking about infrastructure and water and things of that nature, meeting fundamental and security needs and so on, at the lower levels of the Maslow hierarchy. It's an interesting set of developments that are happening. And I'm going to wrap up by talking about, okay, the strategy paradigm, as BoH said, we need to rework that. Strategy is the construct that links an organization and an environment. And I think two things. Unlike economists, we've got to recognize we can manage our environment, select our environment, and also we'd like to propose a different way of thinking about organizations, because the classic descriptors of organizations don't work anymore. And we talk about boundaries. What are the boundaries for an organization such as GE? What are the boundaries for an organization like the University of Pittsburgh? We are everywhere from Mongolia to Prague. It is a fascinating notion. The notion of structure, when I did my MBA, as I kept seeing, a very, very long time ago, structures were given. We stole from the Catholic Church and the military in terms of the hierarchical forms, and essentially kept the structure constant. But today, Honeywell sees structure as a variable. But if you talk to people like this, they'll tell you, how can you define my boundary? I have partners all over the world, and we're sharing people, and our people are in their sites, and their people are on our sites, and it's evolving over time. So this is a local Pittsburgh company, iGate, which again says the same thing. The strategies are changing, the structures are changing. So when you look at these classic notions of how you define an organization, that do not work. And what we are suggesting is it's a rather different way of identifying what's core, distinctive, and enduring about organizations. And when talking to Vodafone in the Czech Republic, Muriel Anton, who's the CEO, said this about her organization.
I know some people say, you know, do organizations have values? I say, you know what, actually, I think the people in the organization have values. And it was quite an interesting exercise, because when we completed this, it was a very common and cohesive list of values that were represented, and they were quite common across all of the organization. This wasn't like a top-down approach.
I'm not going to play the next video, but what the next speaker says, who is the head of, she likes to be called Vice President People and Vice President Human Resources, demonstrates how values affect what people do on a daily basis, on a minute-to-minute basis, which this drives their thinking, their strategy, and their success. But they think of Vodafone Czech Republic as a person, and they identify the personality of this person and are using that as a guide. So essentially, we are talking about an enduring notion of organizations in terms of their identity, their values, which we expect to endure, their aspirations, which continue for a long period of time, and the competencies, which take years to develop, and hopefully they hang on to for periods, which goes, it's not the product, market, technology notion of strategy, it's not the structural notion of strategy. We have, organizations. We're talking about organizations in a very different way, almost as if organizations are people. If you introduce the idea of humanity, if you recognize the dynamism of the business context and the complexity of the problems that organizations are facing, you really get a situation, is one of my favorite terms, you get a notion of wicked issues. There are situations where the future is unknowable, totally unknowable, perhaps even indescribable. And how do you operate in that situation as opposed to this context, which is the arena in which most of us think we are operating? That we can understand the context, that we can predict the future, and consequently develop a strategy or an approach that makes sense. And we accept the notion of volatility and use a whole lot of mathematical techniques, like my colleagues do, to try to understand this. But and it's perfectly valid and important to do that, but there are contexts where this doesn't work. And we're trying to capture those ideas and approaches and responses and techniques that are appropriate to this context as part of this project also. Lots of notions about why wicked problems are so different and so, how shall I say it, not amenable to being handled by the traditional technologies we use. Some of the ideas in terms of responding to wicked problems, but really it boils down, this is something there are some techniques here that we can use, but humaneness as the guiding light for decisions. You tend to do better if you bring these criteria to play, as opposed to some very unreliable notion of what future profitability might be based on some notions of volatility. In this context, we've got to do something which I think is more alien to the US context than anywhere else. There's a notion that when things go unexpectedly, they're not necessarily a failure. We're talking to Dr. Ravichandran yesterday, who heads IIM Indo, and he says he expects many of his fascinating initiatives, some of his fascinating initiatives to fail, quote unquote. I'm using a four-letter word there, fail. But what he was saying is these are learning experiences. You wouldn't have that understanding otherwise. There's a necessity to experiment, and this is your favorite person, Andy. He was talking to Andy at the time.
Yeah, and you're not able to predict which way the technology will move. But given the fact that we actually take a big spectrum and put a lot of investments, small investments in small pieces around that. We invested in Bluetooth pretty early. Today it is commonplace, but when we invested, we actually put 4 or 5 bets on it. We put some things which were on the application side. We put some bits which was on the networking stack side. Okay, so we put some bets which were on the hardware chip side. So what happens is that the chances are that one of them will succeed.
This is one of the big three in India. They're already in the US, in Atlanta. In fact, one of our alumni is working with them. Dr. Jagdish Sheth is on the board and has been engaged with them. But they have a very different notion of how to approach this world and what failure means and what an experiment is. The idea that you're talking about is organizations. We are suggesting there's a notion of identity that's crucial that we need to develop. In terms of looking at the business environment, we are talking about global reach, multiple economic segments, the bottom of the pyramid, which is an arena that John Prescott is looking at very closely. We are talking about a strategy process which is very different from the linear, highly structured, routinized analyses that we do, but maybe a creative, issue-triggered process. But essentially saying, what is the future we'd like to operate in? How do we create that? Working back from that, connecting the organization and its environment in a way that sparks creativity and life and thinking and instantaneous responses to developments. Why is this project necessary? More and more organizations have corporate social responsibility on their websites, make this as extraordinarily important. But in terms of doing it, they're doing it because of public pressure, because they're expected to do it. They don't really understand or value it intrinsically. As Paul Krugman said when talking about green economics, this is any serious solution must rely mainly on giving everyone a self-interested reason. One of my core disciplines is control. In a control situation, in an organization, what you need to do is to create a context where people acting in their own best interests act in the best interest of the organization. And what you're talking about is creating a system where people are going to pay attention to notions of humanity because it's in their own best interest. And that's what we are developing. The academic world is beginning to see this. I pulled something out from the leading strategy journal where they say good stakeholder relations, stakeholder, not stockholder, stakeholder, not only enable a firm with superior financial performance to sustain its competitive advantage for a longer period of time, but more importantly, also help poorly performing firms to recover from disadvantageous positions more quickly. Now, this is the paradox. When we are in a difficult situation, companies move away from notions of CSR. They lay off people, they cut down on environmental responsibility, they don't emphasize human resources development. But the fascinating thing is the research shows you pay attention to that, you turn around faster. So we are essentially accelerating our decline by the old kinds of decision systems that we are using. And more arguments for why this is necessary. What I'm a little bit concerned about and what I promise that BoH and I will not do in this project is get caught up in the academic perspective. It's a very powerful set of ideas, but I'm not sure that the practitioners here will draw anything from this. We're going to say, what do you do 9 o'clock Monday morning? So this is important. The academics are getting into it, but we will adopt a slightly different perspective. And this was HBR recently, and essentially they're saying it's utterly necessary because stakeholders know what you do, can understand what you do, can measure what you do. And it's interesting, companies like Walmart originally started paying attention to sustainability and human resources because of external pressures, but now it's become part of their decision process. It's intrinsic to them, and we hope that will happen, especially because as more and more, because of the academic work, because the work of companies are able to better understand and measure decisions in terms of how they impact humanity. Again, the notion is, let's bring in some stories, some narratives, some qualitative understanding of what the context is to flesh out and truly go way beyond the numbers in terms of understanding how an organization's strategy should evolve. This was the cover story in Newsweek. Layoffs are literally killing people, increasing morbidity, and also, interestingly, hurting the bottom line. I learned about things such as survivor's guilt, working with organizations that have downsized. I was talking to our MBA class just across the hall last week, and people were talking with me later about what some of the experiences they've had and how badly the organization has been hurt because some of the short-term cost-cutting measures that were taken, which don't even reduce costs, but actually create both long-term and short-term problems. So we need to have a different perspective here, Pfeffer is also talking about this in academic context, and he looks at the research and which reinforces the proposition that he talked about in Newsweek. And this is something close to what you're saying, but you're not Pollyannish enough to talk about happy companies. You're talking about something more basic. But it's interesting. There are practitioners who see this as important, looking at the context itself. And this was fascinating. Sloan Management Review, significant people, like, heads of Novartis and Coca-Cola. Toyota is up there, which is an interesting notion. But non-market strategy, taking into account factors of the kind that we are talking about as part of corporate strategy. And when I read this article, I was thinking, this is what we learned from Professor Jhunjhunwala. This is what Bopaya and I have been pushing for some time. GE says we are not going to be engaged in taking Western products and modifying them, localize them, as the word is, for other contexts. What they have done is said, disruptive innovations happen in contexts that are different from the situations we are comfortable in. In this article, Jeffrey Immel, CEO, along with Vijay Govindarajan, I don't know who Chris Trimble is, but Vijay Govindarajan is a professor at Dartmouth who works very closely with GE. They're essentially saying if you want GE to transform, if you want GE to grow, if you want GE to innovate, if you want GE to be the source of disruptive technology, it's not going to happen here. It's going to happen in contexts that are very different than what you're comfortable with. And they have explicit examples of how reverse innovation is taking place. Products that are developed in Israel, in India, in China, are then modified and used in Western economies. And the interesting thing is truly disruptive technologies emerge with that reverse innovation approach. But companies are not set up to do this, which is the fascinating thing. GE has recognized it. They said, okay, if you take India, India's 1% of the profits are contributed by India. Why would senior management look at India in terms of investment? So how do we set up a structure and systems and techniques to motivate companies to look at sources of disruptive innovation which are not high on the radar screen right now? So those are some interesting issues that we're looking at, but it's fascinating to see GE, which is an iconic company in terms of planning and control, recognizing this fundamental notion that we have been talking about for some time now. And John, with your permission, it's nice to have the boss support what you're doing, so let me play this.
Now, I want to go one step further with regard to the notion of the business of humanity. I believe that it's a concept, an idea whose time has come. It's because business of humanity, in addition to being a nice turn of a phrase, is an accurate depiction of what we're trying to accomplish in a world where we all live on the same planet and we all need to work together cooperatively to improve everyone's life and to be successful.
We have to develop a win-win situation as opposed to the somewhat defensive approach that has been popular in the US.